So what are we doing, Rob?
We don't know yet. So the results are in. Um, uh, to talk about a couple of the data points really quick that I think are interesting. Um, Nobody wants us to do a military game, Mike.
Yeah, which is, I guess, not strange to me. But I thought that the idea that we discussed for a military game was pretty interesting for as far as military games go, and it was certainly like our style of a
Yeah,
military game. You and I are not going to do, or unlikely to do at least, grid based room to room corner clearing. We're going to do military politics.
yeah.
But apparently, no one gives a shit about that. That's okay. My feelings are not hurt. That's
As,
fine.
so I get why people aren't interested in a military game. I'm not super surprised. I am kind of surprised by how absolute it was. Like nobody wants us to do a
That it
military
was
game.
not in the middle at
Like
all.
I think out of all the votes, I saw one person put it at like a 6,
Out of
but
10.
yeah, out of 10. But most people, it was in their bottom 3. But the one that was surprising to me is nobody like uh, its superhero scored very low, which as much as we've discussed superhero stuff, I'm kind of surprised people don't have more faith in it. But I wonder if it's because we discussed how we didn't think we'd be able to do anything mechanically interested, and
Yeah.
people just aren't interested in our superhero setting.
I mean, that could be true. We also did talk a bit about how we're not like we didn't have a strong inclination for what we would do with it,
True.
right? Like we were pretty much like, we don't know what we would do, but we could probably do something, which is not a strong endorsement coming from a creator, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
if you're gonna listen to someone talk about the projects that they're interested in, the one that they say, I don't know what I would do with this, but I could probably come up with something, is probably gonna rate pretty low on the stuff that you tell them to pursue, and the stuff that they have like immediate ideas for and seem excited about is probably the stuff that's gonna get your attention.
So let's talk about what got people's attention, because similar to how there was a theme across the bottom, there was a theme across the top, and that was people seemed the most interested in occult and family saga, and after the episode came out, prehistoric fantasy got a pretty serious bump in the votes. But prehistoric fantasy was kind of the lower high end. A few people did like. I don't have the data in front of me right now because my computer is being weird. I don't think I saw anybody give occult or family saga like a 1 or a 2 like at the bottom of their score, but I know I saw people put prehistoric fantasy at the bottom. But also a bunch of people put prehistoric fantasy at the top, and more importantly, Mike and I both rated prehistoric fantasy very highly in our list. So the top 3 though were pretty clearly occult, family saga, and prehistoric fantasy, with spy, criminal, and dark fantasy coming in just below those.
So we're gonna make the R. Kelly RPG.
The R.
He
Kelly?
did an album. He did an album called My Dark Fantasy.
Oh, no. I
Okay.
didn't know that, so I don't feel confident in my ability to do that.
Okay.
Literally, all I know about R. Kelly is that he pees on people.
He does that. That's what his dark fantasy
And
is.
honestly, rather make giving thanks than a game about peeing on people.
He also does grooming, child grooming for sexual slaves. Pretty good guy. And peas on people. You're definitely right about the peas on people part.
Well, this
He's not a great person.
took a pretty dark turn.
You know, humanity is not super cool. Anyway,
Way
let's
to
talk about the things that we actually
way to
liked.
bring it down, Mike.
Well, I went for the My Dark Fantasy joke, and that didn't go anywhere, so then I had to explain it. The jokes are always better when you have to explain them.
It got very dark.
It did.
Like honestly, darker than I'm comfortable with.
I apologize.
Which like longtime fans of the show will be like darker than Rob's comfortable with. Listen, a lot about me has changed since becoming a parent.
Yeah, he's got kids now. He
Like
cares about things.
I am soft as fuck compared to what I used to be like. The opening to Watchmen, I fucking cried. Like, not because it's super sad, but because, like, go watch the beginning of it. And then, if you're not a parent, imagine being a parent, and then just fucking cry. I cried. Fucking
Okay.
rolled tears in the first 5 minutes of that show.
No one here right now is judging you for that. I want you to know that.
No, it's not that I feel like I'm being judged. It's just I'm trying to explain the gravity of the situation.
Okay.
So, occult, prehistoric fantasy, and family saga. Those are the three genres that seem to be the most voted on, both by the listeners and Mike and myself.
Should rename this show to Mike and Myself.
Mike and myself?
Yeah, it's a good podcast name.
Can't be worse than Bear Swarm.
Because, well, my name's in it, so.
And mine's not. So it's everything you want.
Exactly. It's everything I want. Basically, you do all the work, and I get all the credits.
Your name's in it, but it is implied that the show is about me.
Yeah. I'm okay with that, because you're going to do all the work, but I get top billing. Because not only is my name in it, if your name was in it, it would be last, because it would be myself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, myself and Mike doesn't have a good ring to it.
Exactly.
Also, I think grammar. But what do you want to talk about first, Mike? Occult, prehistoric family? Prehistoric family.
Prehistoric family.
Prehistoric fantasy or family saga?
Dealer's choice, whatever you prefer.
No,
We did talk a little bit about them beforehand, but we explicitly ended those conversations. Like at one point we were going down kind of a rabbit hole, and Rob was like, let's talk about it on the show.
Yeah.
Okay. So whichever one you prefer. That's what I'm saying. Like, and you're like, which one do you want? I'm like, dealer's choice. That means it's your choice.
I know, but you can't say like you can't like in response to me being like, which one do you want first? You can't be like, well, dealer's choice. Like,
sure, I can.
No.
I just did. It happened.
I'm not gonna pick one.
To keep the show moving, because we all know that I'm the most important element in order to keep the show moving.
The show is Mike and myself, so
it is.
Mike.
Let's talk about let's talk about Family Saga first.
Okay.
That is the last of the three that we discussed off air, so it's a little bit fresh in my mind.
So we kind of discussed trying to narrow down the genres a little bit, especially with Family Saga because it is so broad. And so I have like short concept statements for each of these, which is the direction that we're going to go. We're going to try to flesh it out a little bit here. So for a Family Saga, one of the things we really want to focus on is how families grow and change and evolve over time. So the thrust of the game and the mechanics around the game are about how starting as siblings, over generations, how a family either grows apart or grows together through external struggles and challenges. And for the other, like to inform what that external struggle and challenge is, we're talking about setting it in an alternate history version of Earth. We were kicking around ideas about maybe making the game modular and being like presenting multiple different alternate history starting points. Or maybe we'll discuss and try to narrow it down to one that we're really excited about and be like, this is a story about how families grow and evolve in this specific version of an alternate history. And I think it'll be fair to say, and Mike and I haven't discussed this, but we are mostly interested in more recent alternate history than doing something like, say, like, if the Roman Empire never fell, what would the world be like today?
Right.
But probably going back 100 years.
Yeah, part of the reason why alternate histories like that are less interesting is because they very quickly become unrecognizable.
Yeah.
So anything in the past 100, maybe 200 years, like I would say like Industrial Revolution and later is probably workable. But anything going back further than that, and the world very rapidly becomes something that is impossible to compare to reality. And for alternate history games, especially one that's going to explicitly take place over a long period of time and generations, and you're going to get to see the world continue to evolve. One of the most interesting parts of that to me is the comparison between how things are in the real world, or how things were in the real world in a comparable time, and what the world has become. I find that really, really intriguing. And the idea is also that whatever the divergent point in history is from our timeline, that's like generation one in the game. So,
Yeah.
like, your first characters, which are all siblings, are going to be living through that event.
That
And
event
then from
that
there,
that does
it's
correspond with history,
right.
but by the end of that generation or throughout that generation is when the deviation begins.
Right.
So you'll be able to start the game with some grounding, with some familiarity, but then every generation we will deviate further and further and further from history.
Yeah.
Honestly, like thinking and talking about it more, I'd be more interested in like picking a thing and setting up the game to be like, and being a little more concrete about what this world is that this family is growing and changing along with, than presenting multiple starting points for the players to choose.
Well, I think that the game idea lends itself really well to expansions and stuff like that, because you just
Yeah,
pick a new divergent point, right? You just say, well, instead of World War I, now our divergent point is 1960 in this event, and this is what's different.
yeah,
Um,
that's a good point. We could make a conscious decision to be like, core book is rules plus base divergent setting, and then that'll enable us to do more content of different divergent settings along with these core rules.
yeah,
Because I don't think the core rules for how families grow and change need to be necessarily coupled with a direct setting, as long as the the framework of it is modern settings. Like if you tried to do this same game set in ancient Rome, I think you would have to have some different mechanics to discuss how families grow and evolve.
yeah.
But as long as we're like, the game is concerned with 1900s and beyond families.
Hmm.
So, what do you think an interesting starting point for a history, an alternate history would be?
So part of me, and this could just be because I know you and I are fans of a show that centered around, at least in its beginnings, the similar event. But part of me thinks that choosing something that's a little bit that's not necessarily a world-shaking event, but is something that uh, the majority of the world is aware of and would have some sense of. And what actually came to mind first was the sinking of the Titanic and Downton Abbey, because it that's not an event that necessarily like changed the world completely, but I think it is potentially interesting if you're portraying people that are affected by that event in some way, and because you are affected by that event, your actions and choices and the things that you do are what end up changing the world. So rather than something like I know that there is a pretty popular alternate history that is about the Confederacy winning the Civil War. It's called
Racism.
uh, mm, it turns out that they collapsed like 60 years later because their fucking society was broken. Which, like, when I heard about it, I was like, so it's basically a Southern white man's fantasy. But as I like learned more about it, I was like, oh, actually, he's basically saying that the Confederate states were completely impossible to sustain based on their
Yeah.
society and way of life and
Okay,
how it
so
was
it's
structured.
even if they had one, it wasn't going to be
Yeah,
long.
yeah, basically they won, which changed some stuff. Without getting into it, it changed the way that Europe identified with Americas, which changed the way that Europe and America had relationships in like World War I and stuff like that. And then yeah, I think it's like less. It's definitely less than 100 years later. The Confederate States of America collapse, and yep, it turns out that their society was unsustainable, at least according to this. alternate history.
Okay.
Um, but anyway, like rather than choose, like it could be interesting rather than choosing something pivotal like that and changing the world in a major way, choosing a event that happened and making the game about why your family decided that that was the event wherein history changed. I think that those are also like potentially very different styles of games. Like one's very like high in terms of like the importance that your family is likely to play. It's if you're a family of Kansas farmers, it's difficult to see how that family of Kansas farmers changes the outcome of World War I, right?
Yeah.
Like, but it could be interesting if you were, say, the family at Downton Abbey, and you're all upper crust British nobility, and maybe this event, for whatever reason, primes you to start politicking and advocating for the rise of the British aristocracy again, and then you accomplish something to that end, and over time, rather than becoming less aristocratic and more democratic, Britain actually goes the other direction through the machinations of your family. Like that could be cool. Or maybe there's a rise of an aristocratic class in America. Like, I think that that's interesting. It also makes the setting a bit more personal.
Yeah.
But I think that there's two different ways to look at it. Like, do you want to say that your characters are shaping the setting, or are you simply tracking how your characters behave in a setting as it's changing from what you recognize? And I don't think either answer is wrong.
So I think one of the interesting things is making a pivot point, being the Titanic sinking, is that generation also then goes through World War I, and then you see the world like you see. So the Titanic sank in 1912. So that first generation is like 1912 to say 1930.
Yeah,
And the next one is uh, 20s to 40s, and then 30s to 50s. You know, because you're gonna kind of stagger the generations
right.
like that. Because
There's a bit of an overlap.
yeah, because like the first 10 years of a character's life, I'm not gonna play a 1 year old.
Right.
But so you go through a lot of early turn of the century historic events. You know, by your third generation, you're in World War II. You know,
Yeah.
so that doesn't necessarily sound like alternate history, though. That just feels like playing through history, where the players are the ones who determine how history deviates. Which,
Yeah.
like, I'm not saying like that's a bad thing or whatever, but it does put a little more onus on the players and the GM to decide where the importance within the world is.
Mhm.
That would be acting as kind of the external adversary on the family. Again, not saying that's a bad thing, but it's something to
Right.
be like. I feel like if in designing this game we would have to give guidance towards here are things to think about and consider, and it would become
Sure.
kind of advice laden.
Right. To a
Again,
certain extent, that might also require your GM to be a history buff, right? Like to say, like, well, if you change this, then well, that means that this treaty that was signed in this year probably doesn't happen, which means changes this, so that could
well,
get pretty cumbersome.
it either means that it means a GM who is a history buff, like, and specifically like if we're doing like British nobility, a British history buff is going to be a much stronger GM than anybody who's not, and we
And it's
need to
probably going to have a real good time.
yeah, and we need to put extra effort into making sure that the book presents enough historic knowledge that you can build that without being a history buff,
Mhm.
which I think is a more daunting task than just saying, you know, this thing happened which changed history, and then we just make it up from there, right?
Yeah, I think one of those games is much more open-ended on the design side of things.
Yeah,
Yes, Crazed Madman in chat just said Harry Turtledove is the author of the "If the Confederates Won the Civil War" alternate history.
gotcha.
I just don't remember what the name of the series is, but he is the author.
So
Which, again, going back to that for just a moment, with a name like Harry Turtledove, you can understand why I assumed that he would be a Confederate sympathizer. Like, just saying, like, that's a very Southern genteel kind of a name.
yeah,
Anyway, yeah, I think that from a design perspective and a writing perspective, one of those is definitely much more open-ended and hard to write something, especially like definitive for. Like, it's tougher to give touchdowns, right? Like
yeah,
the historical touchdowns for that, because fucking we don't know what you might decide. You might decide that because the Titanic sinks, that you definitely want to keep history the same, or that your actions don't change history, right? Like, you become super patriots and blah blah blah, whatever. Whereas I think that if the focus is a bit more on exploring like experiencing a slightly different reality, then it's probably a better idea to choose a historical event that pivots, and for the designers to then decide, like, at least what the touchstones are on in terms of like world stage politics, right? Like, okay, World War One did happen on this day, but it doesn't happen on this date because things have changed a little bit. Instead, it happens here, and the who's on whose side is a little bit different, which means that so you start building out, like, and because of that type
yeah.
statements, right?
And I think, like, especially if we design the game with those statements built out across generations, it gives us a little more freedom to kind of explore and play. Because if we take something like, so picking another random point in time, like if we say the deviation in history is that, instead of America developing the first atomic bomb, uh, it's Britain, and it's
France, Japan,
yeah,
anybody.
yeah. It's another country developed the atomic bomb, and Japan ended up not getting bombed, or maybe we never invented atomic technology. Like, maybe that never happened. I
Yeah.
mean, World War II was pretty much done, even without us bombing the shit out of somebody. Uh, contrary to American patriotism, in that we won the war by bombing Japan.
There's just a whole lot of we were gonna have to fucking fight Japan for every goddamn inch.
Yeah, but if
And I don't say that as in like I'm down on Japan, and like most historical analysts agree that Japan couldn't win, but probably like millions more people were gonna die
yeah,
just in the battles.
but the European fronts had pretty much started dying
Yeah.
down by the time we did that.
There's a reason why Berlin didn't get nuked.
Yeah. So if
It was over by then.
if we take the stance of, let's say the deviation is, we never invented atomic technology. That never happened. Like, that's going to have huge ramifications across the world.
Yeah. Or even something simple like we developed atomic technology 5 years sooner, and instead of Japan getting nuked, it was Berlin that got nuked.
Yeah.
That changes the world dramatically, even though the outcome of the war is still largely the same in terms of the Allies still won, quote unquote. But,
Or
Germany's fucked.
if we say, like, the use of atomic weapons created a atmosphere in which atomic energy was no longer explored, and humanity pushed
Right.
forward towards different energy like initiatives. So, like, now you never have Chernobyl or 3 Mile Isle. Like, you never have atomic power plants being built. Again,
Right.
this changes what the world looks like in, like, a subtler way that we can then start running down, like, what that, how that kind of shakes out or reshapes the world or whatever. And we can say, like, all right, generation 1 is the end of World War II. Atomic technology is kind of at a standstill and not developing. Generation 2, the world needs a new energy source, and it's on you to figure out what that is. Here's a few different branches you could take for it. Generation 3, like, and you start building out, like, this quest for building a better atomic engine and the effects that has on the world. And you're the family that's paving the way for the world to have a new energy source.
Or maybe not.
Or, yeah.
Like, you could be doing anything. Like maybe there is one player in your group whose entire branch of family has a strong scientific background. Maybe another one went into the army and has always gone into the army. Another one went into, social sciences, and another goes into exploration and ends up being one of the first people on the moon.
But
Right? Like those are all still related,
yeah,
but
I think the thing that inevitably with Family Saga, one of the weaknesses of it is the further down the generations go, the less direct impact the game's going to be able to have on that story, and the more it's going to rely on the players and the GM. So
yeah.
we can give you a good starting point and a good 2-3 generations, but by generation 5, your world should have deviated so much that it's not recognizable anymore, and that's going to be on you.
And I think that makes sense from the idea that it's a family saga too, because by 5 generations in, your characters probably struggle to know each other unless you go out of your way to make sure they do.
Yeah.
Right? Like by then, just the family tree has diverged so much that
Well,
yeah, you're related, but like
especially if the question we're asking in the game is by the 5th generation, is your family closer and tighter or further and more deviated?
right,
Like, if your family's grown together, if by generation 5, like, you're like, you know, all the players are still like, yeah, we're like 5th or 6th cousins, but we're all still Rockefellers, and that means
right,
something to us, you know.
yeah.
Uh,
And you can also reboot the game at any point by just saying like, okay, we're all that player's children next generation.
yeah.
Like if things become too divergent, that you refocus, right? And I think that that's at a certain point, no matter what, it's gonna fall. Like if you play this game forever, at some point your game will look nothing. Like that's true for every RPG.
Yeah.
If you ever change, if your characters ever have an impact on the setting, if you change it, if you play it long enough, your setting becomes unrecognizable when compared to anyone else's. But I think that the people that will play the game for that long at that point are comfortable with
Yeah.
having a wildly divergent
But
uh,
I think it's
timeline.
something we should consciously design for
Yeah, I
and
agree.
give tools to the players and the game master to say, like, we'll hold your hand through what the first 3 generations look like for both your family and this world. But then after that, here's the tools you need to do
Yeah,
the heavy lifting.
yeah. For Generation
Or,
4, like here's some ideas, and for Generation 5, uh,
like you said, here's how once you hit generation 4, you rebase back down to what generation 1 looked like.
yeah.
You know?
It's something that I as we talk about game design, I'm gonna adjust my monocle and say like something I learned when I was designing 7C. Something that I learned very quickly is that the players that are comfortable with making shit up don't need your permission to make shit up. The players that are not comfortable making shit up are the ones that need your attention.
Yeah.
Like they're the ones that really want you to say, okay, what happens next? And the player that says, I'm comfortable with making up what happens next, he doesn't care whether you're okay with that or not.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think that's why it's really important that we in for this genre in specific, we take pains to design tools for the people who aren't comfortable to help get them more comfortable or give them something to use. Like we make it explicit that we're giving you permission to do this, and here's a few ways you can get there
Right.
because that's going to be the avenue to success. I think one of the things that we made a mistake with in 7C is saying this is a game where the players have the people playing the game have a great amount of agency over the game, and then we didn't give tools to the players who aren't comfortable with that.
Yeah.
So, anyways, that's Family Saga. We're going to talk about
Yeah.
families growing, coming together, evolving over time in a
In an
setting
alternate history.
that is an alternate version of our reality to some
A,
degree.
a fairly modern alternate history.
Yeah. All right. Let's pivot. Let's talk about the occult. So, our concept for an occult game is that we want to do a game that's set in the early 2000s, uh, possibly pre 9/11, that focuses on the rise of the internet and the occult connections that could build. So we're talking about a world that's before iPhones, that's before the proliferation of smartphones, but the internet does exist and it's starting to come into focus. Google will go public in like 2004, 2005. So it's just before Google becomes a big contender in the world. So we're
So
talking,
YouTube's not a thing yet, but internet chat rooms are.
yep. You have bulletin boards, the dark web exists, the BBs, the bulletin board systems, the AOL online, right? The world is starting to get interconnected, and
Broadband internet is available in colleges and almost nowhere else.
yeah, most people are still using dial-up. And the big thing that this has given to the world is the ability for the cults of the world to find each other and to build a base that is larger than they've ever been able to before. And in this game, we're going to make the assumption where like it is going to operate on occults are early adopters of internet technology and are going to be cults are reshaping the world of technology for their purposes.
Right. So thinking about things like, and this is something that I kind of passingly mentioned when we were talking before the show. Think about it almost like being creepypasta the RPG. So things like the SCP Foundation, which if you don't know what the SCP Foundation is and you're interested in weird horror, just go Google it. I can't possibly explain what it is to you.
Well, we
But
kind of
things like
talked about it
that,
last episode too. So
yeah. So things like that, things like Slenderman, all those like early internet mysteries are signs of like occult and cultist and pseudo magical activity. And another thing that I passively mentioned is like, what is the cultist's best friend? The anonymity and reach of the internet. When you can talk about, how Cthulhu lays dead and dreaming at the bottom of the ocean, and people will listen to you, even if they don't take you seriously, that's fine, and none of them can find you.
but the people who do take you seriously now have
Right,
a foothold within this world.
right. And I think that's so we were talking about the eras to set this in as well, and I think that era is really strong for you and I, specifically because we fucking lived through it in our formative, like early adult years. So we're intimately familiar with, particularly like internet culture,
Yeah,
right? Like we fucking grew up in that precise culture that we're about to discuss, and that puts us in a really strong position to modify it in small ways and understand how those small ways might change the culture overall or expand it, or to talk about the culture in of the early internet in ways that feel authentic. That's not to say that this is a game about being on the internet where everyone's a hacker or anything like that.
yeah.
It's just that the internet and its beginning to proliferate is the best friend to the 21st century cultist loves the internet because it helps him spread his crazy ass views everywhere. And the more people that know about your crazy ass views, the stronger your cult is.
Well, to go back to a strong occult inspiration of H.P. Lovecraft, the opening line of the Call of Cthulhu is, "I think the most merciful thing in the world is the inability for the human mind to correlate its contents." And this setting for this game says that's correct. Now the internet exists, and now people are able to correlate the contents of their minds in a way that has never been seen before in the history of the world.
Right.
As we discussed in the previous episode, I think it's important that the occult in this game is ambiguous. Like,
Right.
people believe that there's a
Yeah, it may or
monster,
may not be real.
but whether it's there or not, like, the question isn't whether Cthulhu is real, but how many people believe that he is, and
And what are those people willing to do?
what impact are those people having on your world. So
Right.
this brings it back to who are the player characters in our occult game. So they have to be people who have access to the internet, who have an invested interest in cults. I don't want to make a game about being cultists.
Right.
So we're
Although you could certainly like, I think that you could. A part of being in the game is not about being in a cult, but being interested in them, right? Like delving into what they know, but not necessarily believing it, at least at the outset.
yeah. I think an interesting area for your character to explore in the game, and perhaps even tying mechanics in it, is how far can you go while remaining on the outside, and what happens when you cross over.
Right. When you say I'm no longer casually asking questions, and I'm like, so what's up with this Cthulhu guy? Tell
Yeah.
me more of Slenderman.
So
How could I like? Let's say I wanted to meet Slenderman. How would I go about that? Okay, you've crossed the line.
So the characters are going to have to be some kind of investigators, some type of team that is, for one reason or another, tasked with or have chosen to delve into the rises of cults on the internet.
Yeah, I think that your typical cadre of Lovecraftian protagonists is perfectly fine here. Your investigative journalists, cops, government agents, new age, uh, um, new age religion followers. I do Reiki. Yeah, that's cool. Have you seen this shit?
Yeah.
Those kind of people are perfectly suited to this kind of game. Just keeping in mind the era that this is taking place in. So your your investigative journalist very well could be a very early blogger,
Yeah.
or trying to break into a traditional journalism via being shoved onto the digital team, and thinks that it's bullshit that they can't write for the quote unquote real paper. But then as things go and start progressing, or maybe you're the a young new police detective just promoted, and you get stuck on this new cyber thing. Nobody really knows what it's about, but there's like three people on the team, and you're the youngest one by about 30 years, which also means that you're the one that knows the most about this internet. Like, I think all those are reimaginings of the traditional
Yeah.
Cthulhu protagonists that fit really well with this idea.
So one of the things that I would like to do is make sure that we give the players and the GM the hooks that are necessary to bring a group of players together. One of the things that I dislike about a lot of RPGs is that they give you rules to create characters, but not rules to create a group.
Yeah.
And especially with this kind of setting where there's not an inherent team involved, right? Like we have this in the Family Saga we're talking about, right? Like you're all related. That's how all your characters are connected. I think it would behoove us to set a term for how the characters interact with each other as a base assumption for the game. Basically, instead of being like, all right, GMs, figure out how you bring these five random ass characters together, we say, here is the thing that all characters in this game are required to have
You know what I
in order
think
to
could
unite
be a
them.
really cool way to accomplish that in a really simplistic and setting reinforcing way is to say, what is the IRC chat room that all of you met in?
Yeah?
And with the understanding that, like, from there, you all kept in contact. But, like, What's the fucking weird place where all of you bumped into each other? It could be anything, right? Like, but the understanding is you all know each other, you know, from the internet. It's Luke Meyer from the internet. Or was it Tony Mast from the internet? It was Tony Mast from the internet, wasn't it?
Yeah. So
My bad.
I think that's good. I think taking it that next step and be like, all right, what's the chat room you met in? What's the topic of that chat room? Like, why did you end up there? Tell us about your relationship with this
Right.
chat room. Then, when did and why did you take the next step and meet each other in person? Because I think because of this era, it's important that these characters can cohabitate in the real world, and it's not just this, like, because what I don't want is that, well, we all met in this chat room, and now the GM has to run a game that's set in both Seattle and Washington D.C. and Kansas City and London.
Right.
But it's like you all met in this chat room, and then you all found out that you live in Seattle together.
Right. Or you could even take it a step in the other direction and say the GM says all of you met in this chat room. That gives the GM the option to say, like, if he wants everyone to be local, then obviously that chat room is local. So, like, for example, if he's like, it's a Seattle game, you all met in the IRC channel, Weird in Seattle, or Seattle nightclubs, or whatever. Like, maybe that's the GM's, like, how does the GM put his stamp on, like, before you make characters, right? The GM says, okay, whatever characters you make, all of you met in this chat. And then part of setting the GM's expectations is he describes, like, because you all met in this, Seattle is weird chat room. Obviously, the implication is you're all from Seattle or the surrounding
Yeah.
areas.
And
Stuff like that.
I think that should be our default posturing for like how we present it to the game master, with a note being like, hey, if you don't want everybody co-located, you can do whatever you want, but this game's not going to support that. Like, that's not like you're going to be out on your own if you do that.
Yeah, you're going to do a little bit of heavy lifting
But
to figure out how the British dude and the Egyptian dude and the New Yorker.
But back
do
to
stuff.
your point, the players who are comfortable with that will do that.
Right.
So, early 2000s, rise of the internet, investigating cults and cultists. Monsters
Cult and
may or may
cultists,
not be
yeah.
real, doesn't really matter.
Magic may or may not exist.
One of the things that Mike and I touched on prior to the episode that I don't think we have an answer for, and I don't think we're gonna have an answer for on the show, but we do think that in some context we need to discuss or cover the topic of 9/11 and how that changes and reshapes the world from a security standpoint, from an American nationalism standpoint.
In everything, right?
That
like, say what you want about the event, it changed the world. I think that's inarguable.
yeah.
And I feel like setting a game in that era and then just pretend and ignoring that event is inauthentic. Like, it is how what like I can't imagine a world like that. At that point, it immediately becomes an alternate history, like hard alternate
Yeah.
history.
Well, especially for saying like the game is somewhere between 2000 and 2004. There is no way that even as far out as 2004, people aren't still reflecting on and making decisions based on the events of 9/11.
Right.
So we recognize that we will have to address it in some way, and that we do not want to trivialize it or even necessarily make it a focus of the game. Like, I definitely don't want to be like, cults existed because 9/11.
Right.
Or not, cults caused 9/11. It wasn't these real world political situations of like America supporting Afghanistan in,
Sure.
In fighting Russia and then pulling back on that support, and, all the geopolitics that went into 9/11. I don't want to trivialize that by saying Cthulhu worshippers,
Right.
And at the same time, I don't want to be like 9/11 happened, so of course Cthulhu worshippers.
Right.
But I do think that we need to give consideration to, especially with the internet, how security and cybersecurity and the interconnected nature and the xenophobia that came from 9/11 impacts this world. But I want to get out in front of, this is not going to be a 9/11 occult game.
Right.
But
It is not a game about 9/11. It is a game that takes place in the time period where that happened.
yeah, similar to if we set a game in the 40s and never discussed World War II, that would be weird.
That's disingenuous, yeah.
So we're not making a game about 9/11, but we are aware of its impact on the world, and we will have to address it in some
We'll
way.
have to talk about it, yeah.
Even if it's not like a page discussing it directly, but like, since 9/11, airport security has become increasingly difficult, like,
The NSA monitors the shit out of the internet now.
yeah.
So cults have responded in this way.
Yeah. The 9/11 caused the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, which tightened up on the monitoring of these kind of networks.
Right.
So cults were driven to this other avenue or this different thing. I mean, maybe that's even a way to connect the players in the game. Maybe the players are like the branch of Homeland Security that stumbled on internet cults and were like, what do we fucking do?
What the fuck is this shit?
And you're essentially in the Wild West of a new government agency being developed, and somebody's like, well, let's earmark some budget for it, and you guys are a special unit dedicated to investigating this.
Yeah, because especially in the under the auspices of a brand new investigative branch of the government, especially one that's about law enforcement, I can see all those character types being brought in, right?
Yeah.
Like the investigative journalist who's been brought in because fucking knows the internet really good, and the cop, the cop straight out of the academy that's doesn't know the internet super good, but like is more familiar with it than most cops, and stuff like that.
It can be the thing where there is a agent within the Department of Homeland Security that stumbled across a network of cultists that then was given funding and told, build a team, and you're that team.
Like, the boys.
That could be really fun.
Yeah.
So that's what we're doing with cults. That's what we're going to do with the occult.
Well, if we end up doing the occult game.
Yeah, that's our pitch for an occult game.
What are we doing for prehistoric fantasy?
So I'm not going to lie, this one has been on my mind a lot since we initially discussed it, because it really captured my imagination in a way that a lot of the other things we discussed didn't. Not saying that, I'm not excited to make the games we've just discussed, but there's something about the uniqueness of a prehistoric fantasy game that I wasn't ready for, and then my brain had to keep working on. So our concept, and as we discussed on the previous episode, when we say prehistoric, we're talking about the rise of civilization, the move from a hunter-gatherer society to an agricultural society. And when we say fantasy,
this newfangled thing that have been around for maybe 50 or 60 years.
Yeah. And when we talk about fantasy, we're talking about the birth of magic. There was an inspiring event that created magic in this world, and now people are exploring and discovering magic like almost in like a scientific way through experimentation and exploration and uncoveries of new mysteries, not of lost knowledge.
Right.
One of the kind of hallmarks we discussed before is that you will not go into a cave and find an ancient tome. You will be going into a cave to write an ancient tome.
Right. Something I mentioned jokingly to a friend of mine this past week when we were talking about something unrelated to this, but it reminded me of this. I joked like, "What does a wizard's spellbook look like when you don't have paper? When you're carving everything on like thin metal sheets?" And fucking, you want to be a wizard? Cool. Here's 20 pounds of fucking metal. Also, written language isn't a thing. So we're talking like pictograms and like how do you fucking record like how do you record your discoveries when paper is not a thing?
Yeah.
How
You
do you pass on that knowledge when there is no such thing as a universally understood written language?
yeah, when your wizard tomes are cuneiform writing on stone tablets.
Yeah.
It in a lot of ways it limits the scope of what you have with you.
Yep.
Um,
Which even that concept alone, like how does the traditional wizard who carries around a spell book where all of his magic tricks are, how does that guy function in a world without paper? Like I think that alone is super interesting.
yeah. So, um,
He has to have a vault, right? Like I could just like all wizards have to have vaults, and
well,
they are never far away from their vaults because that's where all their knowledge is.
that's why wizards start building towers.
Right. And again makes sense. Like, why does the wizard never leave his tower? Because he fucking can't take magic with him. Fuck you! I'm not leaving. You step in my door, I'll fucking incinerate you. I step out, I'm just a dude with a staff.
So in some ways that almost makes magical characters unplayable in a certain regard.
I think it could.
Like depending on how far we go with it.
Right.
Like if we decide we could easily relegate magicians to the realm of NPCs, which
Right.
I think that could be a fair decision to make.
Yeah.
But I think one of the aspects of this that I don't think we've discussed is that I think it should be a city based game. Since we're talking about the rise of civilization and the kind of the birth of the first cities, I think focusing in on like instead of making it like a traveling journey, globe trekking, go from here to here and experience all the different aspects of the world. If we just zone it down on being like this region, the cradle of civilization, the first city of men is being built right here, and the players are the architects of both civilization and magic here and now.
Could be. I was thinking about a lot of exploration. I think that either way, you're definitely like from one of the cities, and like not in a casual way, right? Like you're sponsored by a city, you work for the new city, and even if what you're doing for that city is going out and exploring distant lands and meeting other cities that like no one has ever fucking heard of before because it takes 6 months of travel to get there, or have like right like no one knows that there's a city over there. You've heard rumors that there's another city over there, so your city has said, you five people go to that city and see what they're all about and see if you can make some kind of deal with them for, we have this idea for trade. It's radical, but we have some stuff. See if they have some stuff, and maybe we can do a swapsies. I think that the idea of exploring the world on behalf of one of the cities is equally as compelling. But I don't want to do like freewheeling adventurers.
Yeah.
I think that the rise of civilization is too much of a focus in this game for the characters to have rejected it. Because
Yeah.
that's what adventurers have done, right? They've said like, "Fuck cities, I don't care.
Yeah.
I'm from nowhere."
Well, so I see where I see the appeal in that, but if we're thinking about what this looks like from a world building standpoint, either we're going to have to create tools for the GM and the players to create these cities and this world and what all this looks like, or we're going to have to create a setting for them.
Yeah.
And if I'm giving tools for creation, I would rather give tools for creating the city that civilization is rising in than broader tools to create the world in which these things are starting to occur. Does that make sense?
Sure.
And alternatively, like if my focus is on building out a world for this game to take place in, I'm more interested something about kind of just zeroing in on a area or a region appeals to me a lot more than what is going to end up being like broader brush strokes for more places. Like I think if you go with the city that is birthing civilization, you can get a lot more nuanced and detailed about that area than if you're like, these are the 12 cities in this world that are kind of rising up at the same time, and here's this one, and here's how they're different, and you know, it spreads your world a little thinner.
Maybe.
And it's yeah, then it becomes about the players exploring that, which really is about the players creating that.
Yeah.
Because exploration is fucking boring. Like,
Right.
if it's just like, oh, you found this pre-written text box, right?
Yeah, I agree.
So, I don't think that either of these are wrong. I just think my preference leans more towards having the players make decisions about a specific location than the world as a whole.
Okay. I mean, we can like if we decide to do the prehistoric fantasy, I think that that's a distinction that we can make at that point.
Yeah,
I think both are perfectly valid paths.
I think the important thing to for people to understand what this concept is to us is that it is about creation.
Yeah.
And it's about the players and the GM creating the birth of history. And that's the focus of the game. It's not about like going out and exploring tombs and fighting monsters and getting loot. It's not like the traditional D&D gameplay cycle. It's about like
Correct.
if you go out and find this ancient tomb, which is weird,
It's probably worthless to you
like
because you know what's not down there? Magic.
like you have to like I guess it wouldn't be about exploring ancient tombs. It really because nothing's ancient at this point, right?
It would be about exploring like the wilds,
Yeah.
mapping unexplored areas.
So yeah,
Like you wouldn't want to go into tombs because there's like
there's
things from the past have no value to you because everything new is better.
yeah.
Like, I think that's the core principle of this that sets it apart from traditional fantasy, which we talked about last time. Is like in traditional fantasy, magic is old and ancient and lost, and that's why you want to plumb the depths to retrieve what once was. Now, what once was is fucking worthless to you because magic wasn't a thing, before 10 years ago.
Well, also like what once was is a generation or two ago, and going into this tomb is walking into somebody's crypt.
Right.
Like you're exploring a graveyard.
Yeah, and even if you did find a cave where people lived, during the last ice age, they didn't fucking have magic, so it's useless. Like you can go down there and find some bones that have no value, and you can probably find some rotted, long dead animals that also have no value.
But it's about like it would be about like going and exploring the wilds, right? Like
Yeah,
and the question isn't like what monsters do you fight in this cave, but what relevance does this cave have to the civilization that's growing around you? Why is this cave important to you in your city now?
yeah. When your city does send you, like, the exploration that I think would be interesting is when your city does send you to the other city that they've heard rumors of. What they tell you is our interest is making a road between these two places. So that's what we want, right? Like we're trying to expand from a city to, you know, a civilization. Um, and I think that you achieve that from either the two directions that we're talking about, right? Like, it's just a question of, are you the guy that sends the people to the other city, or are you the guy that goes to the other city?
But and
And
that's
I
the
think
thing.
both of
Like,
those are.
I think it's less interesting being the guy who goes to the other city because what is the story of building a road between two cities?
I don't think you're building it. I think you're negotiating.
I mean, it's like regardless, like if the story is about getting a road built and building a road, is that interesting enough that I'd want to engage on that for like a campaign?
I think so. But again, it's a thing that we can,
Yeah,
if we decide to go with prehistoric fantasy, it's a decision that we can make at that point. I think that the idea at the crux of it is that you're building you're building the future rather than trying to recover the past.
yeah, and it's important to note that like no matter what, the characters are the architects of civilization.
Right.
And I think it's important that like this extends beyond magic even like magic
Yes.
is a frontier to explore but so is the entire idea of a settlement.
Yeah. Steel. That would be fucking crazy.
Yeah,
Can you imagine if we made metal tools? Holy shit. We'd get so much done. Just got to figure out how.
so on the fantasy side of things, uh, I am perfectly content and interested in limiting it to human fantasy, more Game of Thrones and less Forgotten Realms. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I would be fine with our prehistoric fantasy not having elves or dwarves or like other races.
I think if it has them in the future, not now. Right? Like, almost like a Shadowrun-esque idea of like they're all descendants from humanity. So like, the elven race is the result of one of the first wizards experimenting with people and figuring out how to make them live a long time, and another one is the dwarves are based off of a guy that wanted to make humans hardier and stronger and tougher and stuff like that. So I think that yes, there are no those races either don't exist or didn't exist until like just fucking now. Like I think everything should be new. I think that's the tagline, right? Like
Yeah,
everything fantastical is new.
and it's the game's really the story about how you get there, and
Yeah,
I think that's the if elves are going to be real in your world, it's not because this NPC did it. It's because one of the players said, "How
I
like
want to make
I want
elves.
to make elves. How do I back into that idea?" And I
Yeah,
think it's important that all the characters have a thing that is a fantasy idea that they are working to enact. Like, what is it? Like the game is about everything is new. It's about the creation of everything. It's about the birth of everything. What is it that your character is bringing into the world? And it's like I'm going to be the guy who makes the first spell book, which means I need to invent paper, which means I
yeah.
need to invent bookbinding. Like there's all these mundane things that feed into it, but
I'm gonna yeah.
my
I'm
goal
gonna have
is
the world's first professional army.
yeah. Or you know, I'm going to create non-humans. Or I'm founding the first city. I am the king of this city. What is my
Yeah,
goal? To have enough food to sustain a population.
right.
And the question is all about all these big important figures in this setting who are preparing to shape and change the world and create fantasy for the first time and how they butt heads.
Right.
Like, what happens when the guy who's like, I'm going to build the first fucking army, the first massive army, and another guy's like, I'm building the first city, so let's talk, because I could use the
Right.
protection, or don't fucking kill me.
Yeah.
And then there's the guy over here who's like,
You have a lot of people that need food. I'm building a city that's going to produce a lot of food. Eh?
and then this other player over here is like, yeah, well, I'm gonna make fucking Dragonborn, and the guy who's
Yeah.
like running an army is like, that sounds like a good soldier,
Yeah.
and then the guy who's running a city is like, that would make him way too powerful, like,
Yeah, that sounds terrifying.
and so then it becomes the politics between the players who are birthing fantasy, who are birthing the first civilized fantasy, and how they achieve their goals or don't achieve their goals, and what the world ends up looking like through the course of them doing this.
Yeah, you're playing like the pre-mythological version of all those characters that the fantasy book talks about in ancient times. Like, oh, this king, did this, and this ancient wizard was the first to create dragons by making this magic, blah blah blah. You don't read about that guy, you are that guy.
Yeah.
The first general in the world who led this massive army. Yeah, that was me. I did that.
So that's prehistoric fantasy. That's what we're doing.
Well, maybe. If we do prehistoric fantasy, that's what we're doing.
Yeah, that is our specific pitch for
Right.
prehistoric fantasy. And those are the three kind of ideas that we have. Again, we'll put a vote up and we'll let people decide on whether you're interested in an alternate history, how families come together, evolve, and change over time. If you're interested in the early 2000s and the rise of the internet and cults, or if you're interested in the birth of civilization, the rise of magic, and the creation of the first fantasy world. No wrong answers.
They all sound pretty dope to me, legitimately.
Yeah.
Almost like we're really good at ideas.
I'd be into any of these.